It wasn't the Armada. It wasn't the plague. It wasn't even the loss of the Netherlands. It was the math. Specifically, the compound interest on a debt. Debt could never be repaid. History remembers the battles. It remembers the kings. It remembers the maps changing colors. But it rarely remembers the ledger. And that is where empires actually die. Not on the battlefield, but in the bond market, in the currency exchange, in the quiet desperation of a middle class, watching their savings evaporate. We look at Spain in the 16th century. The greatest power on earth, the empire on which the sun never set. They had the best infantry, the largest navy, the richest colonies. And yet within 90 years, they were hollow, bankrupt, broken, a shell of a superpower. Why? Because they ignored 5 specific warning signs, 5 structural fractures that appeared one by one. They dismissed them as temporary. They dismissed them as the cost of doing business. They thought they were special. They thought the laws of economics did not apply to the masters of the world. The pattern is unmistakable. The arithmetic is merciless. And if you look at the data coming out of the United States today, if you look at the debt service costs, the geopolitical overreach, the internal division, you realize something terrifying. We are not just making similar mistakes. We are following the exact same script, line by line, dollar for dollar, crisis for crisis. This is not a political statement. This is a forensic accounting of a crime scene that hasn't finished happening yet. The incentive is to look away. The incentive is to believe this time is different. But the history of finance teaches us one thing above all else. It is never different. To understand the gravity of our current trajectory, we must first strip away the mythology of empire and look at the mechanics of decline. It is crucial to recognize that the collapse of a superpower is rarely a singular catastrophic event. It is a process. It is a slow grinding erosion of fundamentals that is often masked by surface-level prosperity. The rot always begins at the peak. It begins exactly when the society feels invincible. This is the paradox of hegemony. The moment of greatest triumph usually coincides with the moment the structural integrity begins to fail. We will examine this pathology through 3 distinct historical precedents. We will look at the Roman Empire's 3rd century crisis. We will look at the Spanish Empire's suffocation by its own wealth. And we will look at the British Empire's long, agonizing, solvent decline in the 20th century. In every single case, the pattern holds. The timeline varies, but the sequence of events is identical. Let us begin with the Roman Empire, specifically the period following the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD. For decades, Rome had enjoyed the Pax Romana, a period of relative stability and economic expansion. But beneath the marble facades, the fiscal engine was seizing up. The empire had stopped expanding, which meant the influx of loot and slave labor, the primary fuel for the Roman economy, had ceased. Yet the costs of maintaining the empire were fixed and rising. The legions on the Rhine and Danube required payment. The bureaucracy required funding. The grain dole for the citizens of Rome required constant supply. The turning point came with the ascension of Septimius Severus in 193 AD. Severus was a military man who understood power, but he did not understand economics. His advice to his sons was simple: enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men. To fulfill this mandate, he raised military pay by 50%. But the treasury was empty. The tax base was maxed out. Under these constraints, the rational move for a ruler who needs to survive the week is to cheat the currency. Severus began the systematic debasement of the silver denarius. In the time of Augustus, the denarius was roughly 98% pure silver. It was sound money. It was trusted from India to Britain. By the time Severus was done, the silver content had dropped to roughly 50%. This was the first warning sign, the detachment of currency from reality to fund political imperatives. But the real acceleration occurred 50 years later, during the crisis of the 3rd century. By 268 AD, the silver content of the denarius had collapsed to under 5%. It was essentially a copper coin washed in a thin layer of silver that rubbed off after a few transactions. Think about the impact on the average Roman citizen. A baker in Antioch or a merchant in Gaul did not understand monetary theory. They only knew that the coin they received today bought half as much wheat as it did last year. The incentive structure shifted immediately. If you held cash, you were losing wealth every second. So people stopped holding cash. They moved into hard assets. They hoarded goods. Trade networks broke down because no one trusted the medium of exchange. The state's response was not to fix the money, but to attack the population. In 301 AD, Emperor Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices. This was a massive document listing thousands of goods from beer to lion skins and setting a strict price cap on each. The penalty for violating the price cap was death. The penalty for withholding goods from the market was death. The arithmetic, however, did not care about. The death penalty merchants could not sell goods for less than it cost to replace them. The result was empty shelves. Entire markets disappeared. The economy went underground. The complex urbanized society of Rome began to de-urbanize. People fled the cities to work as serfs on large fortified estates just to be close to food sources. The middle class was wiped out, leaving only a tiny elite and a massive impoverished proletariat. Just like the Roman experience, the Spanish Empire in the 16th century fell victim to the exact same delusion. But with a twist, Spain did not debase its currency. Initially, it was flooded with money. Following the discovery of the Americas, Spanish galleons began transporting literal mountains of silver back to Seville. Between 1500 and 1650, roughly 16,000 tons of silver entered Europe through Spain. On the surface, this looked like ultimate power. King Philip II had unlimited credit. He could hire mercenaries from all over Europe. He could build the Armada. He could fight wars in Flanders, Italy, and the Mediterranean simultaneously. But the influx of silver triggered the price revolution. Because the supply of money increased faster than the supply of goods, prices in Spain skyrocketed. A pair of shoes in Salamanca cost 4 times as much in 1600 as it did in 1500. This inflation destroyed Spanish industry. Because prices were so high in Spain, Spanish goods became uncompetitive. It was cheaper to buy cloth from England or weapons from Germany than to produce them domestically. Spain became a hollow conduit. The silver arrived in Seville, but it flowed immediately out of the country to pay foreign bankers and foreign merchants. The Spanish middle class, the artisans, the weavers, the manufacturers, was priced out of existence. Meanwhile, the crown was addicted to debt. Despite the silver, Philip II spent more than he earned. He borrowed against future silver shipments, issuing bonds known as juros. The interest payments on these bonds began to consume the entire budget. In 1557, Philip II declared the first sovereign bankruptcy. He would declare bankruptcy again in 1560, 1575, and 1596. Each time the banking dynasties of Europe, the Fuggers and the Welsers, took a haircut, but they kept lending. Because the geopolitical stakes were too high, the social fracture was absolute. The Hidalgo culture took over a disdain for manual labor and commerce. The rational move for a wealthy Spaniard was not to start a business, but to buy government debt or land and live off the rents. The productive capacity of the nation atrophied. By the time the silver shipments began to decline in the mid-17th century, Spain had no industry left to fall back on. They had exported their inflation to the rest of Europe, but they had imported their own destruction. The warning signs were ignored because the elite were insulated by the constant flow of liquidity until the day the ships stopped coming. Just like Spain, the British Empire in the 20th century provides the modern template for this cycle. In 1914, Britain was the world's creditor. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Safe as the Bank of England was a literal statement of fact, but 2 world wars shattered the national balance sheet. To fight the wars, Britain liquidated its foreign assets and borrowed heavily from the United States. By 1945, Britain was technically insolvent. The debt-to-GDP ratio was over 200%. But the political class refused to accept the new reality. They attempted to maintain a global empire and a massive domestic welfare state simultaneously. This is the classic guns and butter trap. To bridge the gap, they relied on the sterling area system, where colonies and Commonwealth nations were forced to hold their reserves in pounds effectively, lending money to London at below market rates. The market, however, eventually forces a correction throughout the 1950s and 60s. Britain faced a series of sterling crises. Each time the government had to defend the pound by selling gold or raising interest rates, choking the domestic economy. The defining moment came in 1967. Prime Minister Harold Wilson was forced to devalue the pound by 14% against the dollar. In his broadcast to the nation, he famously said, "This does not mean that the pound here in Britain, in your pocket or purse, or in your bank has been devalued. This was a lie. Import prices surged. The standard of living stagnated. The unions, seeing their purchasing power erode, demanded higher wages, leading to the winter of discontent in the 1970s. Garbage piled up in Leicester Square. The dead went unburied in Liverpool." The endpoint of this cycle arrived in 1976, when the British government, humiliated and out of options, had to apply for a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. The empire that had once dictated terms to the world was now subject to the conditionalities of a Washington-based institution. The decline was managed, but it was total. The dominance of the pound was gone, replaced by the dollar. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages. Stage 1 is sound money. The nation has a hard currency, low debt, and high productivity. Growth is driven by savings and investment. The culture values thrift and production. Stage 2 is expansion. The nation becomes a dominant power. It begins to take on geopolitical responsibilities. Spending increases, but the economy is strong enough to absorb it. Optimism is high. Stage 3 is overreach. The military and social commitments exceed the nation's ability to pay for them out of current tax revenue. The government begins to borrow heavily. Politicians promise both guns and butter. Stage 4 is fiscal dominance. The debt becomes so large that the interest payments begin to crowd out other spending. The central bank is captured by the Treasury. Its primary mission shifts from maintaining price stability to ensuring the government can fund its deficit. Stage 5 is debasement. To keep the system floating, the government begins to actively dilute the currency. In Rome, they clip the coins. In the modern era, they expand the balance sheet. This creates artificial asset bubbles and enriches the asset-holding class while crushing the wage earner. Stage 6 is inflation, and control prices begin to rise visibly. The population loses trust in the currency. The government responds with price controls, capital controls, and crackdowns on hoarders or speculators. Social cohesion fractures. Stage 7 is the reset. The system becomes mathematically impossible to sustain. A default, a hyperinflationary collapse, or a massive currency restructuring occurs. Wealth is transferred on a massive scale. The old order is swept away. Just like the Romans, the Spanish, and the British before us, the United States is now flashing every single one of these indicators. We are currently oscillating between stage 5 and stage 6. Consider the first warning sign: fiscal dominance. The U.S. federal debt is now growing at a pace that defies comprehension. We are adding $1 trillion of debt roughly every 100 days. The interest payments on this debt have now surpassed the entire defense budget. This is the mathematical point of no return. When a nation spends more on past mistakes than on future security, the end is visible. Consider the second sign: imperial overstretch. The U.S. maintains hundreds of military bases, globally subsidizing the defense of Europe and Asia, while domestic infrastructure crumbles. Just like Philip II in Flanders, we are funding conflicts thousands of miles away with money we do not have. Consider the third sign: the hollowing of the middle class. Just as the Spanish price revolution destroyed local industry, the globalization of the last 30 years, fueled by the reserve status of the dollar, has exported the U.S. manufacturing base. We import goods and export debt. The result is a bifurcated society, a wealthy elite who own financial assets, and a struggling working class dealing with the rising cost of living. Consider the fourth sign: currency debasement. Since the suspension of the gold window in 1971, the dollar has lost over 98% of its purchasing power relative to gold. The expansion of the M2 money supply since 2020 is without precedent in peacetime history. We are seeing the results in the grocery store, at the gas pump, and in the housing market. Consider the fifth sign: social fracture. The polarization in the United States today mirrors the two Spains of the 17th century or the class warfare of 1970s Britain. When the economic pie stops growing, politics becomes a zero-sum game. Trust in institutions collapses. The incentive is to tribalize. Some economists argue that the U.S. is different. They point to the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. They argue that because all global trade is settled in dollars, there is infinite demand for U.S. debt. They say that technology will drive productivity high enough to grow our way out of the hole. This is the dangerous comfort of the status quo. It is true that the dollar gives the U.S. a longer runway than Spain or Britain had, but it does not repeal the laws of arithmetic. The demand for dollars is not infinite. We are already seeing the BRICS nations and central banks accumulating gold at record rates. They are building alternative payment rails. The incentive for the rest of the world is to de-risk from a weaponized and debased dollar. The moment that external demand falters, the inflation we have exported for decades will come rushing back home. There are three possible endgames. The first is controlled decline. This is the British path. The U.S. accepts a lower standard of living, cuts spending, raises taxes, and manages a slow retreat from global hegemony. This is politically unpopular and historically rare for a superpower that still has military might. The second is chaotic collapse. This is the Ramong or Weimar path. The government prints money until the currency loses all meaning. Hyperinflation destroys the debt, but it also destroys society. Supply chains break, civil unrest becomes endemic. The third is reset and restructure. This is the most likely modern outcome. A Bretton Woods II moment, where the global monetary system is renegotiated. This would likely involve a devaluation of the dollar against a basket of commodities, or gold effectively defaulting on the real value of the debt while maintaining the nominal value. The pattern is set. The warning signs are flashing red. The precedents are clear. The only variable is timing and pain. Subscribe to the channel, educate yourself on monetary history.